So Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the prince, taught as follows: Im ein ani li, if I'm not for myself, mili, who will be for me? Uchshana ani la'atzmi, however, if I'm only for myself, ma'ani, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And finally, v'im lo achshav ematai, and if not now, then when? Again, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, then when? That's the teaching. Being that the Rabbi instructed to learn the Mishnah each Shabbat in depth, at least one Mishnah in depth from Pirkei Avot, there were many talks that the Rabbi focused on Shabbatot during the summer month on elucidating the depth of Pirkei Avot from the lens of Chassidus, of Chassidic philosophy. So, this teaching in itself, as we spoke about many times, Pirkei Avot doesn't offer to us conventional wisdom. It's not there to give us beautiful prose or catchphrases and axioms. As we spoke about many times in the previous classes, Pirkei Avot teaches us how to climb beyond the letter of the law, to look at the world, and not just the world at large, but a human being who's a microcosm, a micro world, to look at one's world from God's perspective. So we have to delve into this Mishnah. Although it sounds brilliant, if I'm not for myself, who is going to be for me? And if I'm only for myself, then who am I? And if not now, then when? What is the depth of this Mishnah? On one hand, when you really assess the Mishnah, this particular teaching, the first stanza focuses on one's individual's strengths and abilities and the need to take responsibility for one's life and utilize all of one's strengths. If I'm not for myself, then who will be? In other words, first and foremost, I need to be me. I need to utilize myself. In other words, there's no one in the entire world that can fulfill what I am here to fulfill. However, in continuing the second stanza, Hillel says, but when I'm only for myself, then what am I? In other words, as unique as I am, and as much as I'm enjoined to take responsibility or ownership for myself, for my being, for my purpose in life, however, if I'm only by myself, I'm nothing. How do these two teachings align and reconcile with each other? On one hand, at one extreme, there's the individualism. On the other hand, the individual matters nothing if it's not included within society. How do we reconcile these two? We find ourselves many times trying to struggle to express our unique feats, our unique talents and abilities and self-fulfillment, etc., on every single level. But in the world that we live in, where we're constantly needed, and we must meld ourselves to a certain extent with society, how do we retain this uniqueness? And if we aim to retain our uniqueness, how do we blend in with society? And as the Rabbi many times taught, when the Mishnah is brought in the name of its author, means there's a direct correlation between the teaching and the author itself. So when the Mishnah quotes Hillel Hazaken, Hillel the elder, the prince, the president of the Jewish people towards the end of the Second Temple era, this means this wasn't something he just said and someone recorded it as a nice axiom, but this was his MO, this was his entire perception to life. And Hillel, as we spoke about in previous classes, was outstanding in his humility and in his patience. How do we reconcile humility with the teaching in itself? If I'm not for myself, then who am I? That seems a little bit egocentric. In other words, it's me. How do we understand this? Parenthetically, very interesting, we spoke about this on Shabbat, and we're going to see how this streams into this concept that we're developing. Once, while the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the one who wrote the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch, was still a student of his Rabbi, Rabbi Dov Ber of Mizrich, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. The Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mizrich Magid, Rabbi Dov Ber invited the Alter Rebbe for a private audience in order to give him a mission. When the Alter Rebbe came to the Rabbi Dov Ber's door, knocked on the door, Rabbi Dov Ber asked who goes there. And the Alter Rebbe says, it's me, it's Zalmanu. And the Mizrich Magid invited him in and gave him his mission. But this mission turned out to be a complete anomaly. When he came to the vicinity that he was sent in order to accomplish the mission, there was a theft that occurred in the town. And being that he was unknown, and of course he was Jewish, and it was very easy to blame the Jews, he was arrested for the theft. And when he denied stealing anything, they started coercing him, they started hitting him. And he kept on saying, it's not me. And they hit him harder and says, it's not me, it wasn't me. Eventually, it was discovered that it wasn't him, obviously, and they found the perpetrator, the thief himself. Upon his return to his Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe asked the Mizrich Magid, I know that everything is Hashgacha Pratit, and this wasn't just for nothing. Why did I have to go through all of that over there? And the Rebbe said, because when he came to my door, and I asked you who goes here, he said it was me. It's me. So Hashem sent you to say, it's not me. To discover that it's not me. It's not me. How do we reconcile on one hand being humble and yet retaining our unique identity with confidence, with pride? It's very interesting because the same Hillel is quoted in the Talmud regarding the special celebrations of Simchat Beit HaSho'avah that would take place in the vicinity of the Beit HaMikdash, drawing water on a nightly level to be utilized for pouring it on the Mizbeach as part of the Sukkot service. And every single night there was a humongous celebration it says anyone who didn't see the Simcha never saw Simcha in his life. Hillel is quoted as saying, if I'm here, everything is here. But if I'm not here, who's here? And again, the same question arises. Is somebody else saying such a thing because he's so elated and he's so up and up. Okay. But on the other hand, the fact that the Talmud is quoting Hillel must mean there's a tremendous depth, and it's not an exaggeration of oneself. It's an accurate depiction of oneself. In order to understand this, we have to put it into the proper context. We must first come to understand the concept of I, the me. In our dialogue to people throughout the day, how many times do we use the word me or I? How many times? I think. Don't forget about me. What about me? And how many times do we use the word me and I throughout the day? A person says, I want, I don't want, I need, I don't need, I like this, I don't like this. I think, I feel. The truth of the matter, this is not so outlandish. After all, a human being, as the Talmud tells us, as the Torah tells us, is very close to himself. And everything that a human does begins with their perception and their perspective, beginning with themselves. As a matter of fact, and we started speaking about this yesterday in our davening class, the very first prayer that we offer up in the morning is Modeh Ani. Now in English, it translates, I thank, I acknowledge. On the other hand, the standard usage of the word me and I needs to be understood. To what are we referring to? To whom are we referring to when we say I, me? Am I my feelings? Am I my thoughts? Am I my day-to-day work and activity? Many times in the course of classes, in the course of meetings with people, I ask them a very simple question. How much more so in Farbrengens? Who you? Who is the real you? You ask most people, who are you? Not who are you? Who's you? Who is the real you? Many times when you ask a person, you ask, what do you mean, who am I? I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, I'm a husband, I'm a wife, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent, I'm a congregant, I'm a constituent, I'm the mayor, I'm the this and the this. Rabbi Mendel used to give the mashal of Yankel the Pfeiffer, Yankel the Whistler, who once came to the moat of the king and started knocking, let me in, lower the bridge, so I could go to the king. And the guard says, who goes there? And he says, who goes there? What do you mean, who goes there? Don't you know my father started this entire town? It was quiet, silence. Again he knocks and says, don't you, and it says, who goes there? And says, don't you know who my grandfather was? He was the one who gave all the money for this town. And again, silence. Next time he knocks and says, who goes there? And he says, don't you know my brother? He's the mayor of the town. It says, okay, we know who your father, and we know who your uncle, and we know this and that. We're asking who you. In other words, if your entire self is a reference point to what's happening, to external elements, as close as they are, it still doesn't define the you. Many times we think the reason is because people just don't pay attention to this. But the fact of the matter isn't so much because people don't pay attention to it as much as it seems to be self-explanatory. What does it mean? What do you mean, who am I? I'm me. You know, there's a great parable. We all heard about the Chachamei Chelm. Chelm in Poland, there's a city called Chelm where the people, the town folks, were quite brilliant. However, there are many parables about foolishness, very deep parables. There's a lot to learn from them about the foolish people of Chelm. Anyway, once the Rabbi of the town of Chelm was asked by the Rabbi of the shul of Chelm to go to the big town of Lithuania to discover the way of the world and bring that back to the town of Chelm. Go to the shul of Lithuania and see what's happening and how did it manage, because we want to develop our shul as well. Indeed, the Rabbi, the custodian, traveled to Lithuania and entered the shul in Lithuania and met with the custodian of the shul of Lithuania. But upon introducing himself to the Rabbi of the shul of Lithuania, the Rabbi heard about the people of Chelm and their foolishness and wanted to have a good time with him. So the Rabbi of the town of Lithuania turns to the Rabbi of the town of Chelm and says, let me ask you a question. If I'm not my brother, who am I? Rabbi of the town of Chelm was like, wow, what depth, what philosophy. If I'm not my brother, who am I? I knew there was a good reason to come here. And he's racking his mind, and who are you? So the Rabbi of the town of Lithuania starts laughing and says, fool, if I am not my brother, I'm me, the Rabbi of the shul of the town of Lithuania. Wow. Says, this is so deep. I must return back to Chelm and give this over immediately. Upon his return, a large farbrengen was made in his honor so he could share and impart the wisdom that he learned. And then, flanked by all the Chachamim of Chelm and the ministers of Chelm, he says, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share something so profound, life-altering. Let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. If I'm not me, who am I? If I'm not my brother, then who am I? They're all thinking, wow, this trip was well worth it. And they're racking their minds, and none of them could come with an answer. He says, okay, so what did you learn? Tell us. He says, fools, if I'm not my brother, then I'm me, the Rabbi of Lithuania. In other words, he didn't understand, he didn't internalize. His form of identity came from something that he heard someone else say. It has nothing to do with the truth of himself. So this question is not because, many times we think because people just neglect this question, who am I? But most of the time it seems to be self-understood. Of course I know who I am. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, I'm in my... Who are you? So what do you mean this makes... What do you mean who am I? I'm me. See, here in Western culture, this concept of identity has been bamboozled by culture. Who am I? Am I my culture? If I'm a sports fan, I'm a Knick fan. I'm a musician. I love me. Yeah, that's good. But who are you? Many times people, as we see, change their appearance, change their hair color, change their entire disposition in order to define themselves. We spoke about this before, an anecdote from my own life. When I was 17 in my raving stage, my club days, and I had my bleach blonde hair and my Adidas. I remember one day after a party, we ended up in Washington Square Park in the morning, and I encountered a rabbi, and I loved speaking to everyone. So we started speaking, and he asked me a question, which I had a very immediate answer to. He says, "Tell me, why do you dye your hair bleach blonde and you have this suit and so on and so forth?" I said, "What do you mean? I want to express my uniqueness." And he turns me around to look at all my friends behind me, and he turns to me and says, "You mean unique like everyone else?" And many times people assume certain clothing and certain hairstyles and certain cultural stuff in order to fit, to discover their individualism, when in fact that fit actually robs them of their individualism. We know with the famous mashal, the famous parable about the tailor and the groom, that once a groom, several weeks before his chatunah, before his wedding, came to a tailor and asked him to sew him a custom suit for his wedding. And when the groom eventually came to collect the suit, he tried it on, and it was so lopsided. One arm was long, one sleeve was longer, the other was shorter, one pant was shorter, like this. In other words, the entire suit didn't fit. Coming out of the dressing room, he complains to the tailor, "Mr. Tailor, this is not my suit. What did you do?" He says, "No, this is perfect for you." He says, "What do you mean? One sleeve is way longer than my arm. The other one's way shorter than my arm. One pant barely fits. Definitely doesn't go on the waist. And forget about closing the suit. It doesn't even fit." Says the tailor, "Look, the suit is perfect. You are lopsided. Let me show you. If you say that the one sleeve is too long, it's not that the sleeve is too long. Your arm is too short." So he says, "What do you mean?" It says, "It's the way you're positioning your arm. If you extend your arm all the way out, then you'll see that the sleeve fits perfectly." He says, "Okay. And what about the other one?" He says, "The problem with that one is because your arm is too long. You have to retract your arm, and you'll see how that sleeve too fits perfectly." And what about the pants? It says, the pants, well, again, it's the way you're standing. You're standing too upright. If you just crouch down and pull one leg in and the other one a little out, it'll fit perfectly. And what about the jacket to clothes? It says that's exactly the same issue. It's because you're trying to stand in a way. If only you just hunch yourself a little bit and pull in your stomach and just hunch, you'll see. And indeed, it fit perfectly once you did this. When the groom eventually came to his chuppah, walking like he was crippled, everyone in the guests says, what a so sad to see that he is such a disposition. But someone then remarked, "But think about it, the tailor who is able to sew a custom suit to this type of body, that's a genius." So it means that many times we let our externalities define the insides to the point that it chokes the inside, that it cripples the inside. In order to try to find a point of reference of uniqueness, we falsely start believing that I must be unique like everybody else. And when it's not clothing, then it's hobbies, and it's styles, and it's work, and it's this. Humanity aims to achieve self-discovery. But unfortunately, self-discovery doesn't begin with the outside, it begins with the inside. And unfortunately, people who look on the outside can never come to really embrace the inside. To the point that often, because of the deep contrasts, the remarkable contrast between the outside and the inside becomes stymied, and many anxieties begin, and all kinds of issues start with that.
Rabbi, when you say inside, you mean the soul?
Your neshama. But on the other hand, and I said before, unfortunately, because a human being has an essential innate knowledge that they are unique. And for a human being, their essential identity is just as important and imperative for a healthy and holy life as air is to life. And because of this, we're constantly driven and compelled to achieve self-discovery. If you go to Barnes and Nobles or to the library and ask for self-discovery books, and every form of science, and I'm talking about philosophy and psychology and New Age and this, and it will tell you all kinds of very seemingly good suggestions to discover yourself. But while a person could travel along that path for a little bit, eventually they'll find themselves to be empty. One of my colleagues once related that as a chaplain in a jail, he once came to visit a Jewish prisoner. And the prisoner himself related to him in a letter that he doesn't have any connection in his life, and he doesn't feel that anyone knows him or cares about him. And so my colleague related that by the time the meeting was supposed to take place, when he actually traveled to the jail, about a week later, he discovered that the inmate took his life. But he left a note. And what is in the note, he says, what was the straw that broke the camel's back? It was after that the judge was willing to let him out of jail if someone would pay the bond for about $40,000, let's just say $40,000. So it's a nominal fee for freedom. Actually, not 40,000. I did the wrong math. It actually comes to about $2,500. But there was a campaign to raise this nominal fee. But there was one delay and another delay, and no one really came forward to really take ownership. And he took that very, very deeply, and that really, in his mind, destroyed him. or reveal to him the truth, quote unquote, that he believed, I'm worthless. People weren't even willing to put up the nominal fee to give me my liberty. Therefore, I have nothing else to look for in the world. We know a very famous task force in San Francisco that started. It's the suicide task force that started as a result of someone jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and when the leading detective came to the person's home to conduct a search, they found a suicide note. And the suicide note read, I'm about to go and jump off the bridge. If you found this note, it means I did. However, if even one person stops me and asks me, how am I doing? How's my day? I won't. Obviously, they found this note after the guy jumped. So as part of the task force, they made a thing to call people and so on and so forth, to constantly invite those who feel alone and downtrodden. Each person innately feels that I must be important, and when that sense is eroded, one loses themselves. We spoke about in our nurturing relationship class, and we're going to really further this point on next Tuesday evening, that one of the greatest tell of the make or break of a marriage, of a relationship, is how each one feels valued by the other. When one doesn't feel valued, that my interests are not important, my needs are not important, then I'm not important. And that starts eroding the person's not only self-confidence, but their self-worth, and throws them into darkness. Why? Because, as we spoke about in one of our previous classes, one can only notice darkness when they're aware of the light. If one is not aware of light, then darkness is not darkness, it's just the norm. We know the famous mashal that's given in Farbrengens about a family in the old country in Poland and Ukraine, where it was customary for Jews to rent out a field in order to work, but being that they were Jews, they were treated so unfairly, to put it mildly, and the lease price was out of this world, and if the seasons didn't go correctly and so on and so forth, and they couldn't pay, then the fine was to throw the entire family to the dungeon until they were redeemed. And that was the norm. So the parable goes that there was a certain family who was thrown into the dungeon and no one redeemed them. Meanwhile, the family was thrown with their children and there was other people over there, and eventually the children had children, and they would have children, and eventually 2 generations, 3 generations down, one of the children turns to the others. One of the grandchildren already turns to the other one and says, we have an ungrown tradition in our family that there's a world outside of us where there's sunshine and there's birds and there's all kinds of these creatures who fly and these things called flowers and all these things. And eventually we'll get there. We'll go out of this darkness. And the other one says, what are you talking about? It's Baba Mises. Did you ever see this world? Did you ever experience this world? Did you ever hear did you ever see or hear a bird? Or do you ever see a button? Those are myths. Do you know anyone who seen this world? Come on. Says one can only notice darkness when they know the light. the more one knows the light, the more the contrast of darkness occurs to him. So being that innately each person has the light of themselves and is as at least in a very deep level is aware of it, the more they're not attuned to themselves, they're not one with themselves, the more it hurts them, the more painful it is. And I remember in learning for my coaching degree and getting training from Avi Fisher of Twisted Parenting and dealing with children that went through molestation and abuse. One of the very interesting points that several psychologists and rehab psychologists who came and spoke to us mentioned over and over, that only the most sensitive, brilliant people turn out to be drug addicts. In other words, someone who's so sensitive to life but was sort of skewered by it can't handle that contrast, that dissonance, and they need to numb it away, or they need to take something to make them excited about life. In other words, the more someone is sensitive to their inner truth, the more the darkness of not being themselves hurts them. And you think, when you really think about it, and you see this so often, when people are not attuned to themselves, they become attuned to not themselves. They start collecting cars, or they start collecting heirloom, and all of this, not as a financial investment, as an investment in their self-worth. Clothing, and this, and jewelry, this, and that becomes their entire life, and all of it is an escape from the fact that they're not connected to themselves. So let's delve into this. Who am I then? Obviously, and we spoke about this before, we're not our body. We're not the body consciousness. And we know that because even at the most rudimentary level, when someone grabs onto our hand, we say, "Let go of my hand." When someone's head hurts, it says, "My head hurts." It's mine, but it's not me. The hand belongs to me, just like my suit belongs to me. My head belongs to me, just like my shoes belong to me. But they're not me. When a person says, "I think, I feel," it is indicative that the I thinks, but I'm not my thoughts. It's indicative that the I feels, but it's not. I'm not the feeling. How do you know? Because even when a person seemingly is not thinking, or not feeling, or no one's holding on to their hand, they are still themselves. The intrinsic knowledge of the I is exactly that, intrinsic. It's the quintessential self, quint being the fifth element, the element that is the Hebrews call it the gelm, the base, the foundation, that gives expression to everything else that comes from it. And it's very interesting because when we go back to the book of Genesis, Bereshit, when Hashem created the inanimate, or the plant life, or the animal kingdom, Hashem didn't have any discussions with the rocks, with the earth, with the plant life, with the animal kingdoms, to give him any responsibilities in this world, to give him any sense of purpose in this world. He says, live, eat, breathe, procreate, sleep, create habitats, roam. That's it. That's all it is. In other words, exist. Based on the instinct and the drives of perpetuation of your species. And we see this. Their purpose is intrinsic to them. A bird doesn't have to go to a university to learn architecture to build their nests. A bee doesn't need to go to university to learn how to pollinate, doesn't have to go to chemistry school or anything like this to learn how to pollinate, cross-pollinate, and create a hive. And so they don't have to do anything. It's the second they're born, that's it. They're doing it. Dolphins don't have to go to music school or sound school to be able to learn how to distinguish between one sound pattern and another with their sonar. Birds don't have to go to flight school to learn how to fly. They simply leap one day when their wings are ready, off the cliff, and here we go. But with humanity, it's completely different. When Hashem created humanity, immediately He engaged them in conversation, as indicated in the book of Bereshit. And what's the first instruction that Hashem gave to humanity? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the world and conquer it. In other words, I'm giving you a mission in this world. You have a purpose in this world. And what is it? First, on the most simplest level, be fruitful and multiply. Settle in the land. But on the depth, as the Baal Shem Tov explains, what does it mean to be fruitful and multiply? Yeah, on the surface level is to have children. Every human being must have children. Jews, non-Jews, everyone must have children. But on the deeper level, says the Baal Shem Tov, this is to be fruitful and multiply on the spiritual level. In other words, it's not enough for you to be satisfied and content with doing just good in this world and adding holiness to yourself, in your own vicinity, in your life, in your own home. Be fruitful and multiply and fill in the land means your aim is to disseminate light into the world and reveal godliness wherever you go. Conquer means don't break, it doesn't say break, destroy the land, but rather take command over the landliness, the worldliness, the corporality. Don't let corporality command you. Utilize corporality and physicality in order to serve God, in order to fulfill God's desire in making this world a holy abode for Him. From that second on, from that moment when Hashem spoke to Adam and Chava, humanity started looking for purpose in their world. And interestingly enough, as we said before, when one is aware of the light, the darkness becomes ever more palpable. And therefore, when a person inherently deep inside knows I have a truth that I need to accomplish in this world, and I'm unique to the extent that I have a unique mission in this world, but if I'm not attuned to that, and I'm not expressing that on a consistent level, a person starts feeling empty, anxious, lost in this world. And no matter what you throw at him, no matter how much cars or money or jewelry or this or that, it's never going to satisfy them. Because they're going to have this emptiness inside. So why did Hashem speak to the animals to give them purpose? Why only us? Because as we discussed in previous classes in the Tanya class on Monday nights, humans are the only one which are endowed with a soul, a thinking soul. And this soul allows a human being to choose for themselves. They're not compelled to behave based on instinct. Animals have one GPS, their instinct, survivability, basic instinct. And that instinct drives them to fly, to create nests and habitats and procreate and even save them, their kind, or even save their masters and so on and so forth. But it's instinct driven. But we are given the ability to think and to choose based on our thoughts, which are ultimately, or should be ultimately, transcendent of our instinct. In other words, a human being could have a need to survive, but often, and we saw how many times have we seen in our history that Jews went willingly to their death rather than turn away from God or convert and so on and so forth. For Shabbat, for Kashrut. This is the beginning, this is started to scratch the surface of the question, who are we? Hashem, we'll continue this next week.
Thank you so much.